It's time for The World This Week. 7 days, 4 Paris correspondents, 1 hour. The World This Week presented in partnership with the International Herald Tribune. With us, Mildred Cherfis of Global Post. Remind for our viewers, what's Global Post?
Global Post is an international news website based in Boston, which covers more than 50 countries, more than 74 correspondents around the world.
All right, and a dearth of information there, by the way. Also with us, Judah Grunstein. Fewer pictures at a World Politics Review, but just higher on analysis, I'd say.
We concentrate on the text. We're not that developed in multimedia. But,
no page 3 girl.
No, not yet.
Not yet. And Régis Le Sommier of Paris Match, whose motto is...
Who's what?
What's the motto of Paris Match? Remind our viewers.
The weight of words and the force of pictures.
There you go. The perfect marriage. And France 24's Annette Young from our International Affairs Desk. The World This Week, which, by the way, where you can join in the conversation. Many of you have on our Facebook page. And you can also follow our guests and their media outlets thanks to Twitter, our handle @FrancoisF24. It really is a small world after all. When you see the transatlantic spillover of two of the week's main stories. A little bit later, we'll be talking about the debt crisis, but we're going to begin with what's no longer just the UK phone hacking scandal, what with an investigation in the US and plans to reform Australia's media laws. Let's start with the big story this Friday. The former News of the World editor, Rebekah Brooks, resigning as chief executive of parent group News International. The 43-year-old Brooks, a close confidant of Rupert Murdoch. And we can look at what the statement that she gave to staff, where she says, "I feel a deep sense of responsibility for the people we've hurt, and I want to reiterate how sorry I am for what has now taken place. Therefore, I've given my resignation. While it has been the subject of discussion, this time my resignation has been accepted." Now, James Murdoch promising full-page apologies in rival British papers this weekend. The initial apology from his dad, though, well, I don't know if it would even qualify as an analogy. It was published in another Murdoch paper called the Wall Street Journal. And on its front page, they spoke with the 80-year-old media magnate. And he said that there had been mistakes that News Corp handled the crisis extremely well in every way possible, making just minor mistakes. Of course, Annette Young, we've learned since that Murdoch has met with the family of that slain girl, Millie Dowler, and according to a statement, apologized many, many times during their meeting at a London hotel. Apologizing doesn't come easy for Rupert Murdoch.
Certainly doesn't. And I have to say, given my accent, you can tell where I come from, and I know how this man operates. And I love the subheading in the Economist article earlier today, which was, "Couldn't happen to a nicer corporation." I mean, the reality is that News Corp has a take-no-prisoners approach, and it's made just as many friends as it has enemies. In fact, I would argue probably more enemies than it has friends. This was a man who has a fearsome reputation. I mean, for those of us in Australian journalism, we didn't have many opportunities in terms of where to work. He controls somewhere in the order of 3/4 of the print media. And at the very tender age of 21, I made a vow never to work for Rupert Murdoch. Now, I'm saying this now on television because who knows if that will be the case, but it will be interesting to see what does happen to him. And I think we've been talking about this a lot, haven't we, Francois, in the newsroom during the week? And I would say for many Australian journalists, for many British journalists, for also American journalists, it is our own personal Arab Spring to see a man who was seen to be so invincible, who seemed to have a disconnect with public sentiment. I mean, this is a guy who prided himself on being able to predict what the common man or woman wanted to read. But boy, did he misread this scandal, and he really misread the public sentiment in all of this. And the fact of the matter is, I suspect that the News Corp management are thinking very closely now about his leadership. He's 80. Is James Murdoch, who's tipped to be the next person to take over, up to the job? Will the shareholders demand a restructuring of the corporation? Will they sell newspapers? And I think just saying sorry and running full-page ads won't be enough to satisfy them.
All right. Of course, that you're alluding to what was a big turning point as well this week, which was renouncing, taking over British satellite network B-Sky-B in its entirety. Régis Le Sommier, what's interesting is when you speak with British journalists, many of whom never read News of the World, they're sorry that the paper's gone, even though they didn't approve of the kind of journalism it had in it. And they're angry at Rupert Murdoch for shutting it down.
Yeah, well, I think when you see a 168 years old paper being shut down, well, I mean, it's part of, of course, you can criticize the way their outrageous titles and the stories, the type of stories they carried. But, I mean, shutting it down is not going to solve the crisis at Murdoch's corporation. What I would like to comment on is when you look at what's going on in the Murdoch world, I mean, it makes us French news and investigators look like saints. I mean, we've had so many complaints. In France, we have very tough laws regarding public figures, regarding rights to image and stuff. And we are very often criticized that we're, putting our nose into politicians' lives and stuff like that. But we've never used the type of methods that have been, used by Murdoch's newspapers and journalists, and certainly not. And sometimes, we pride ourselves of saying, we don't go as far as the British, but this time we've never gone that far. And like I said, it makes us look like saints.
British journalists quip, well, the French don't even bother going after leads and don't even bother investigating. That was what some of them said to me earlier this week.
Well, they certainly don't hack people's phone and stuff like that, but we do crack stories, every now and then. Maybe not as much as, we're not as efficient, and that might be why, because, but I think there's a whole, like you spoke about, the Arab Spring of our, corporation or of our world, but it might be very well the truth. I mean, it might, set the standard for what's, what's acceptable in terms of investigation and what's not acceptable.
Again, if it's an Arab Spring, but Judah Grunstein, what happens if at the end of all this, politicians get more of the upper hand on the media?
That's always the risk when you have overreach of any of the four estates. But what I was thinking of, what your comments made me think of was especially coming right on the heels of the Strauss-Kahn case, where there was a lot of discussion about not only the different political and legal systems, but also the different laws in terms of newspaper coverage and news coverage, and the different cultures of news coverage, where not only are there legal protections, there's also a cultural protection here in France in terms of people's private lives, public figures' private lives, and so here there's this other, right when the French press might have started been asking themselves questions and testing the waters, there's this major case of overreach where the sense of, we shouldn't even try because it might go too far. The other thing is when you mentioned that some British journalists are upset that News of the World closed, the dirty secret about a lot of these scandal tabloids is that because they have such lower standards, they sometimes do break stories that are real stories. That other journalists won't run because they haven't been corroborated or they're just rumor.
Well, look at National Enquirer in the U.S.
It's the perfect example where National Enquirer ran a story on John Edwards' love child, and
which turned out to be true.
Turned out to be true. No one else would touch it because it wasn't a respectable story, and the sourcing might not have been there. But once it runs, then it becomes the excuse that legitimate journalists have to actually poke around in it. So I'm not saying that justifies. It certainly doesn't justify these kind of practices. But again, closing the paper seems to throw out the baby with the bathwater. The truth is, this is what the readers wanted because there was a successful business model. And every now and then it opens up a story that is worth covering and is worth pursuing.
But it shows the differences between French and English culture, or Anglo culture, which is in the Anglo culture, all bets are off. And, the difference about this particular story is that most politicians and celebrities knew that in the UK and so on. They accepted it. The reason why it resonates with the public is that it was the ordinary members of public who had this time had their phones hacked.
I think it's dangerous to kind of go down the slippery slope of, because that's what the public wants, that's what the public should get, and that's what Rupert Murdoch has been doing for years and years. And I think we as journalists also have gone down the slippery slope of mixing journalism with entertainment, and this just highlighted the dangers of that. And as you say, it is the public that ultimately paid the price, and that's why people became more upset as the story went on. And when it was just politicians and celebrities being affected, it wasn't as serious. But that said, I think we as journalists have a responsibility to separate those lines and to practice proper journalism. I mean, what the journalists at News of the World were doing included corruption and bribery and breaking actual laws. And that's not something that I think we should condone. And I mean, because what happens is everybody gets tainted by that kind of scandal. All journalists become part of the same.
And let's not forget, it was a British journalist who broke the story.
Yep.
It wasn't a government regulatory authority who was doing the investigating. It was The Guardian and Nick Davies who pursued this story for a number of years, pilloried by News Corp executives, and and kept persisting with the story, and this is what he managed to do. So I
So
think
it's more Watergate than an Arab Spring, actually.
Exactly. It shows the power of just...
if we want to reduce it to a headline.
Which I think shows the power of just street smart, shoe leather journalism.
But News Corp culture is another thing too. I mean, News Corp, anybody who's worked at News Corp will tell you. I mean, it's not so much you're only as good as your last story, you're only as good as your next story, and that's the pressure that is placed on the journalists. And that was very clear for any of those journalists working in those tabloids, that they had to come up with the goods.
And now they're all out of jobs. So how far has that gotten them, ultimately?
Another point, we mentioned the chicken and egg over the public's tastes and the newspapers. Next week there's going to be testimony by both Rupert and James Murdoch before the UK House of Commons. Ahead of that testimony, the junior partner in David Cameron's coalition government. Let's not forget that Rebekah Brooks, at her wedding, there was both David Cameron and his predecessor, Gordon Brown. Well, David Cameron's partner, Nick Clegg, summed up that it's a story that's much bigger than even Rupert Murdoch's $46 billion News Corp empire.
This isn't just about Rebekah Brooks or the Murdochs or what happened with B-Sky B. This is about a systemic failure, a failure above all to keep power in check.
A failure to keep power in check. And many people, we were talking about, and it was talking about an Arab Spring for journalists. Many people say in this country, the battle line, the relationship between journalists and politicians may be redefined by the Strauss-Kahn affair. In the UK, there is a similarity in that sense.
Well, in the reversed way, yes, because this time around it comes that how far can journalists go in investigating? Can they, tap? Can they hack phones and stuff? That's the key. It's a little different than in the Strauss-Kahn affair has brought some. Can we investigate a public figure and tell things, or do we have to keep them hidden for years? And if we crack them, if we talk about them, then we go to court because the law is so restrictive in France. So I think it's a little different. I think like you mentioned earlier on that the British and the American journalists complain that the French are not, going after any leads because they feel threatened. Sometimes they feel like they're going to have to go to court, that they're going to have to battle in order to express what common people know, and the Strauss-Kahn affair was definitely showing that, because the Bannon case was how she, of course, now that she, it's a little easier to say her testimony is. Has to be taken into account because she
filed a complaint against
she filed, yes, but before she was neglected or put aside, or even
it was delicate. It was
nobody
delicate
would go in that direction because private laws and that's the problem in France.
Just I was going to say, before we go to the break, at the outset of this story, we mentioned how this story's gone global. And I just want to mention before we go to the break how the U.S. Attorney General has opened an inquiry into whether the phones of 9/11 victims were tapped and if the Murdochs are criminally responsible.
Journalistic ethics in Britain perpetrated by Murdoch have been deplorable, and we should not be importing them to this country.
He's obviously using power and corruption, paying people off to get more viewers. Is it worth it? I don't think so. It's selling the country out.
I think it would be good for the world to see Mr. Murdoch in the witness chair.
All right, the New Jersey Senator Frank Lautenberg calling for Rupert Murdoch in the witness chair. Is that going to happen, Judy Mintz?
Well, I think that it could very well happen, given that there were laws, if there were laws broken. I think, again, getting back to this sort of these cultural differences, because again, if laws are broken, the judicial system should be the police, and the law should be engaged. I have to admit that coming from an Anglo-Saxon news and legal culture, to hear a politician talk about the press abusing power, it's not that I want to defend Murdoch here, but it definitely raises it makes me a little nervous. I've often described the difference in terms of freedom of religion between France and the United States, that in France, the state protects the people from religion, whereas in the United States, the Constitution protects people from the government in terms of religion. And I think the same thing it plays out in terms of the press. In France, the law and the state protects people from the intrusion of the press. Whereas in the Anglo-Saxon culture, it is a free-for-all, and the problem is that there wasn't enough. Perhaps I don't even know what the word is. There shouldn't be legal surveillance of the press, but obviously Murdoch and his organization abused that sort of freedom of the press to break laws. But in the Anglo-Saxon legal culture and press culture, I'm not sure what the response is. I'm definitely not comfortable with the government suddenly becoming very regulatory of the press.
Regulatory on that. Something we're going to be watching. Stay with us. The World This Week continues here on France 24.